And a very warm welcome. You're joining us this week at Hyde Park on Other Derana 24. Sri Lanka's economic crisis and beyond. Recovery beyond growth, but sustainability as a focal point. That will be the theme of this week's discussion. I've invited to discuss Sri Lanka's economy and the journey going forward to our studios, Dr. Roshan Perera, an economist, as well as former director of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka between the period of 2018 and 2019. Thank you very much, Dr. Roshan, for your presence here at Hyde Park, a public policy specialist for over 20 years, and experience has been specifically in formulating and implementing macroeconomic policy in a developing country context, and has expertise in regulating and supervising financial institutions to help strengthen their approaches to managing risks. I think we have much to talk about considering the current risks and uncertainties that the global economy faces. Also joining us tonight at Hyde Park, I've invited to our studios Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar, a political economist, a senior lecturer at the Department of Sociology at the University of Jaffna, chairperson of the Northern Cooperative Development Bank and other initiatives from small and medium scale fisheries enterprises to a focus on the rural economy, and a contributor to a number of journals, an executive committee member of the International Development Economics Associates, as well as a member and executive committee of IDEAS, a global network of economists. I think I'd like to speak on the current context of the economy. Let's begin there. I mentioned earlier about the uncertainties that the global economy faces. To Dr. Roshan Perera first. Despite these uncertainties, they say, the IMF especially mentioned, that the global economy had performed better than feared. But Sri Lanka will be facing a number of other vulnerabilities and uncertainties given the global context. So where do you think we stand? Let's start off there.
So thank you, Indeewari, for having me on this program. So I think looking at the global context, I think we really need to focus on that, because even though the last year the IMF says that they didn't it wasn't as bad as they expected it to be, we don't know what's ahead of us. And especially since I think we really need to, as a country, now move from stabilization to growth. And growth really needs to focus mostly on exports, because we have a very small domestic market. We really need to push up our exports. But exports means we have to engage with the global economy. So although we have been talking about lots of reforms in the recent past, I think we're still behind the curve in terms of doing some of these things. And I think unless we do these reforms, we're going to struggle, particularly in a increasingly challenging global environment. So just to talk about some of the risks. One is the whole risk of rising nationalism and sort of industrial policy in a lot of these advanced economies and even other economies, which basically means that they are becoming more protectionist. And we depend a lot on those markets. So how are we strategizing to address these issues? Secondly, it's the risk of tariffs, escalation of tariffs, because so far we have not seen much of a tariff war as such. But if these tariffs continue or it becomes more prolonged, you could see some kind of retaliatory tariffs, which means that exporters, their markets will start narrowing, and they become more vulnerable to those markets, so which means that they have to have much more diversified trade agreements and markets to go into. The other one, of course, is this whole thing of onshoring and nearshoring of investments and markets. So multinationals and countries are actually trying to shorten these supply chains, go into countries that they think are friendly or who have more political stability and more resilience. And if we don't have those high quality economic zones and have kind of very streamline processes, Sri Lanka risks being bypassed by these countries. And finally, of course, the possibility of tightening global financial conditions. Because even, I mean, the last few years we've had pretty easy financial conditions, but that's not going to last forever. So we really need to, and that's going to constrain borrowing, particularly for export industries, if global financial conditions get tighter. So the country really needs to look for, if we are going to show up our reserves, and we have to, double our reserves or even increase it even at a faster rate before we start repaying our debts by 2028 and 2030.
Do you think Sri Lanka has the current mechanism or framework put in place at this juncture to face 2027 and beyond, or 2028, where our debt servicing commitments begin?
So I think that's why I'm talking about. Actually, we have to really bump up our reserves, because at the moment the reserves that we have are not going to be sufficient when we really start repaying our debts mainly in 2030 or so. And to show up our reserves, we really need to have non-debt creating inflows, which is either through earning our exports and through FDI. But how do we do that? We have to put in the frameworks in the domestic economy to attract these FDI and also to generate the export income that we need to build up our reserves.
Right. I'd like to turn to Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar for your opening remarks on the country's economy. You've argued the failure of the political economy as a reason to most of the crisis or failures that Sri Lanka has faced. So how would you really assess the current reform trajectory and Sri Lanka's position in the face of vulnerabilities or other uncertainties that we see globally, and Sri Lanka's position to face them?
Thank you, Indeewari, for having me again. And I think globally, we are facing probably an unprecedented moment. We've seen historically, like the 1930s, when the global order itself was unraveling. And when that happens, it's not a pretty picture at all, in the sense, if you remember the 1930s and 40s, it also led to the rise of fascism and even a world war, right? So we are seeing all those tensions boiling up as we move away from US hegemony, which has been the sort of global order the last 8 years. And now with the rise of other powers and I think in a way, what we saw this year, the tariffs, right, which were completely unexpected, but they should have been expected, because we've been seeing that trend from Brexit, Trump's first regime, and now. And what he's done is effectively killed the WTO, right, the World Trade Organization. We were told for decades by the United States that free trade and exports was the way to go, and they themselves have put the lid on it. And we can expect similar kind of shocks coming from the financial sector as well. Now we are seeing it with trade, but with global finance as well. So I think the next decade is going to be full of shocks and risks for countries like Sri Lanka. And what Sri Lanka went through and what it's going through now, it's not just unique to Sri Lanka. About half the developing countries in the world are in some form of debt trouble, right? Some of them have defaulted, like ours. Others are struggling to repay their debt, because development financing cannot seem to work in countries like us because of the huge cost of capital. So you inevitably get into a debt trap. So it's in that context that we faced 2022, the default, and then we got into this IMF program and debt restructuring, and that has set the trajectory of our economy. So, this month, even as the government announced its new budget, it's still embedded within that trajectory. And I have argued that economic policy path is flawed to begin with, right? So if you're going to continue in that direction.
Are you talking about the IMF reforms program?
The IMF reforms program, or what people might commonly call the reforms program, in the sense that if you look at the IMF program, it's a 4-year program, and it's going to end in March 2027, right? I have argued that what really got us into this debt mess was us going to the international capital markets, floating international sovereign bonds, and out of our total debt stock, about 40% of it was ISBs and extremely high interest rates. Now, where does the IMF program take us? If you look at their documents themselves, the IMF program, it says that in 2027 and in every year after that, we are going to be floating 1.5% of our GDP worth in international sovereign bonds, right? So we are basically being taken back to the problem. So we went through all this hardship to then again go back to where we had started. But that's where the problems started.
So one would also argue, Dr. Kadirgamar, that when Sri Lanka fell into the deepest of the crisis scenario, that the only way out would have been an extended fund facility program or a bailout from the IMF, because Sri Lanka had to stabilize the economy before working with the rest of the world. So how would you respond to that?
So as you know, this is Sri Lanka's 17th IMF program, right? And none of the 16 prior to it had apparently fixed Sri Lanka, and to hope that the 17th would now deliver us is a big question. But there's something different about this particular IMF program, why the conditions have been so harsh. Because in 2022, not only did we approach the IMF for a new program, we also defaulted on our debt. And the IMF becomes the arbiter for debt restructuring, right? So they had basically a chokehold on us to say that unless you follow what we want you to do, the creditors, that might be bilateral creditors or the bondholders, won't restructure your debt, right? But the other side to that is this program is really meant to support the creditors and make sure Sri Lanka repays its debt to the creditors, particularly these bondholders who are, I would describe them as almost loan sharks, right? The kind of interest that they levy on countries like ours. So the whole program is moving to ensure that we repay the creditors. But is it really in the interest of the people of this country? Is it going to build the kind of economy that we want for our next generations? Is something that we have to really think about.
Dr. Roshan, I'm sure you might have something to add, or you might differ in terms of your comments and your perspective on Sri Lanka's forward journey with the IMF. But at the same time, Budget 2026, are we really focusing on addressing those areas that you pointed out as uncertainties that Sri Lanka will have to work to overcome and address when we move forward?
So just let me go back to what Ahilan said and regarding the IMF program. So I did a study with a few other colleagues we looked at the last few IMF, actually we were looking at all the IMF programs, but we've really focused on the IMF programs in the last 2 decades. And the thing about these IMF programs is we get into trouble because we have, our bad policies, in the sense that we have not done we know what type of policies we should put in place. So if we have overvalued exchange rates, we've allowed the inflation to go up and not really tighten monetary policy when we should have. And particularly we've allowed our fiscal deficits to go out of control. And as a result, it has been a cycle. We have continued to go into these IMF programs, mainly because of our mismanagement of the economy. I would say that. And every time we go into the IMF program, during the IMF program, we behave very well. So the fiscal deficits come down, we bring inflation down, and even exports and the exchange rate starts, we allow it to align with the economic fundamentals. But every time we finish the IMF program, or if there's a change in government, and these are the two kind of incidents that happen, we kind of renege on all those good policies, or we change our behavior and we go back to business as usual. And I'll go back to 2002. There was a document that was produced with multilaterals, with stakeholder consultation actually. And in there, the main focus was really on debt sustainability. And in that, because this was in 2002, and we are talking about every man, woman and child owing something like 70,000 rupees per person in debt. If you go today, it's probably something like 1.4 or 1.5 million. So where have we gone wrong? We basically allowed the debt to balloon, and that's our problem. We can't blame the IMF, because every time the IMF has tried to get us back onto the straight and narrow, we have changed. And the other issue is really, and you can see that, because if you look at, I mean, the only way we can get debt sustainability is by having a primary surplus. The only years we have had primary surpluses is either when we were in an IMF program or coming out of an IMF program. So I think the responsibility lies with us and the governments to ensure that we continue with the right policy reforms. And right now, and talking about the budget 2026, what I'd like to say is, yes, we have continued in terms of macroeconomic stabilization, and that is a great achievement.
This is the budget that's...
Budget 2026, because this is sort of 3 years in succession that we have had a primary surplus, and we are also forecasting a primary surplus for 2026, which is a huge achievement, and that is necessary if we want to bring our debt back into a sustainable level. But that is not going to be enough. Macroeconomic stability is necessary, but it's not going to be sufficient for growth. And for growth, there are many other reforms that have also been told to us, and we know we need to do, particularly on the trade reforms, on the labor reforms, on land reform, on SOE reform, which we consistently put off. So every time we come to a state of stabilization, we think, okay, we've done our job, and then we go back to business as usual, and we don't undertake those much harder reforms, which will unleash the potential of the economy. So I think that's where we fail, and even in this budget, and I can go and talk about a little bit more, we are failing on some of these. I hope we don't fail, but we really need to ensure that we put in those, I mean, to undertake those reforms in the next year. Otherwise, we're going to be, back to square one.
I'd like to talk about the hard reforms that you're talking about later on, but before that, Dr. Kadirgamar, of course, you have your arguments on Sri Lanka working with the IMF or in line with IMF conditions. But at the same time, the macroeconomic stability that we've achieved, that Dr. Roshan is also talking about now. Do you think Sri Lanka is looking at really translating or transforming it into real public investment, to passing it down to the citizens of the country? Do we feel it at ground level? Is the development or stability that we're seeing so far translated into real growth?
Yeah, so it's a question of what this stability means. As Roshan said, the primary budget surplus is at unprecedented levels now. But that is a reflection of what I would call austerity, right? In other words, our revenues are much higher, but our expenditure is abysmally low, right? So now, a former IMF official, Peter Doyle, has said that if you look at Sri Lanka's primary budget surplus targets, which the IMF has set at 2.3% of GDP, is that it's extremely high. That Sri Lanka's best performing peers, countries that are doing really well, Vietnam, India, and so on, they actually, over the last few decades, have had a primary budget deficit of around, between anywhere from negative 0.5 to negative 1.5%. So we're really going in the wrong direction. And I think that's reflected in what the people are facing. Now, I do a lot of research in the rural economy with farmers, fisher folk, and so on. And we are seeing a rise in malnutrition, school dropouts, poverty is on the rise. Even according to the World Bank, Sri Lanka's GDP would only return to 2018 levels next year. So we've lost almost a decade, right? A country like ours should have expanded by at least 50%. We are a developing country during that period, but there's been absolutely no growth. The World Bank again says that Sri Lanka will only reach pre-crisis poverty levels in 2034. So what does this stabilization or recovery mean for ordinary people, really it's a really tough life and a grueling experience for them. So I think we really need to change our economic trajectory. Otherwise, we are going to see rising discontent from the people. So the macroeconomic numbers might show a certain picture. It's probably good for the creditors because it gives them assurance that we would repay their debt. But in terms of growth, in terms of development, what it means to the citizens of our country, we are really not going in the right direction.
Very quickly, when I talk to academics and specialists as yourselves, I wonder whether Sri Lanka has really changed the model. The crisis gave us an opportunity to reset and move forward, but have you really not looked at it as an opportunity? Have you just remodeled what's existing and moved forward? Your comments?
So I agree with some of the things that Ahilan said actually, and but one thing is I think we still need to, the stability was important because without the stability we wouldn't have been able to, I mean we saw the chaos, the economy, the political environment was in when there was no stability. So we had to bring back that stability. Of course, as Ahilan said, the stability has come through increasing revenue, government revenues, and reducing capital expenditure, because recurrent expenditure is very rigid. And when I say rigid, the rigidities come because a lot of them are statutory payments, partly because of interest payments. A large portion is interest payments. So out of recurrent expenditure, you have nearly 46% going for interest. And of course, the other component is salaries and wages. Another 23 or 24% going to salaries and wages. So while the IMF program focused a lot on the revenue measures, I think now it's up to the government to do some expenditure rationalization as well. We need to carefully look at our expenditures.
What would you prioritize there?
So I think one thing is salaries, because interest, of course, I think they have been bringing down the interest cost. And there's not a lot you can do because you have agreements that you have signed and there's not a lot you can do, but definitely you have to maintain the interest cost at a low level. But I think one of the things you can do is on your salaries and wages. And also there is lots of other recurrent expenditure, because I don't think there has been a real look at line by line at the expenditure of the different ministries. There's a lot of fat that can probably be taken out. And this year, and if you look at the salaries and wages actually, the government, the expenditure is going to increase from 3.6% of GDP. It is already increased this year to 3.8% and next year again 3.8%. And the government has already said that it's going to recruit another 75,000 to the government sector. I mean, there might be some rationale for recruiting the public officials to certain categories of also certain grades and certain technical skills. But I think there has to be an overall rationalization and a real close look at the cadre, particularly in light of government's digital government initiative. Are you going to need all these people? And then, of course, you've got to be able to retrain, reskill people and move them. And the private sector, on the other hand, is crying because they don't have sufficient people to work in the private sector. So I think that is one area that needs to be looked at, because if we reduce the cadre, you're going to have also a pension problem in the future, which nobody's even talking about. So I think that is important. And the other one, I think, and Ahilan again talked about it, was in terms of, I agree, poverty is still high. It's over 20%. Real wages have not gone up back to the levels that they were pre-crisis. And the labor force participation rates have actually come down. So the government has, I don't know in this budget whether there's a lot in terms of addressing those. And if you look at the Aswasuma and the amount of that is allocated to Aswasuma, which is the largest welfare program, it's less than 1% of GDP. So I think they're really, if you are trying to do the reforms, because the burden of reform, I agree, falls on the poor. You have to cushion that segment and but you can't not do the reforms. But you really have to cushion that segment of the population. And looking at the budget, I'm not sure whether there has been a lot to address that segment and a lot of recognition of, what they're going through. And if you want to sustain reform momentum, you have to do this, because otherwise there's going to be a lot of opposition to reform in the future, which we can't really, which has happened in the past and which has derailed our reform program. So you really need to address these issues.
I think when we talk about reform, it's also important to talk about the policy priorities here. The same question, did we not change course after the crisis? And how would you say the government must look at prioritizing the economic policy architecture and reform agenda here if Budget 2026 didn't address the urgent requirements of people at ground level? What would?
Yeah, I think what happened in 2022 with the crisis, as we saw, what I would call a counter-revolution, right? We had an unelected president who just went ahead with all the dictates of the IMF, railroaded through a whole bunch of laws. There was a very undemocratic situation for 2 years and set the economy on this particular path. And we are still kind of stuck with it. Ranil Wickremesinghe did what JR wanted to do in 1977, what he wanted to do in 2002, and this was his opportunity as an unelected president to put us on that path, and we're kind of stuck there right now, right? We should have seen that crisis and shifted the direction. Now, Sri Lanka has historically had very low levels of revenue mobilization by the government. Our taxes are extremely low, that's true. But our expenditure is also quite low. If you compare internationally, our recurrent expenditure included is actually quite low compared to many of our peers and other countries. So it's not about rationalizing our expenditure. We need to raise our taxes, but the burden has to be on the wealthy of this country. There was talk earlier on in the IMF program, in the discussions about having a robust wealth tax, right? No sign of it yet.
So just to be clear, Dr. Ahilan, are you saying that expenditure, we don't have to worry about that, but it's tax policy?
Tax policy and
tax
increasing
collection that has to be remodeled?
That's right.
But how so?
And revenues have to be increased by taxing the wealthy. So our income tax brackets have to become even more higher. We have to have a wealth tax. Look at this country. There are people who can hardly afford public transport. In many villages, I've seen people hardly eating 2 meals a day. And look at the number of BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes out on the streets of Colombo, right? This is how we got into this crisis, because we were living beyond our means. We were importing all these luxury vehicles with borrowed money. So we need to increase the tax revenue, not reduce our expenditure. For example, in the university system where I teach, we have to fill so many cadres. So recurrent expenditure will have to go up, as I've seen in many public institutions. Now, coming to the budget priorities. Now, what I see that has happened over the last year, the NPP government has put out the right principles, right? So they are talking about the importance of a production economy. They're talking about the importance of the food system, investing in agriculture, fisheries, and trying to get the life of our people up. They're talking about strengthening education, our public institutions, and so on. So on a principle level, they are in the right direction, but they still haven't been able to change the economic trajectory within which, so a budget is a yearly budget, right? But it has to be set on the path of a different trajectory over the next 5-10 years. That hasn't happened. I think they are nervous, it seems like they're nervous about challenging the IMF because the Western world and many powerful actors back it. And that is how not just Sri Lanka, many countries in the global south get stuck in this path. The IMF's interests, who's the majority actor in the IMF? It's the United States, right? And the West. So they are going to work with their dictates. They're going to think in terms of the interests of the West. But slowly, we have to gain the courage to be able to go on an alternate path. For me, that would be a different set of policies. For example, that we have to give much more importance to self-sufficiency. We wouldn't have gone into this crisis if we just became so import dependent. Until even the month before we defaulted, nobody really wanted to talk about the liberalization of trade and its impact, that we were importing too much. Only now, this year, after Trump puts his tariffs, are we thinking about, okay, maybe we shouldn't be importing so much ourselves, and exports alone is not going to help us, that we need to produce locally. So we have to have a different trajectory. As I mentioned, this for me is a once in an 8-year type of shift that is happening in the global order. And we need a different set of policies, and that's not there in the IMF package or the World Bank development programs.
Right, on that note, it's time we take a short break here at Hyde Park. We are in conversation with the economists Dr. Roshan Perera and Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar on Sri Lanka's forward journey as we come out of crisis, and what reforms are urgently required is the topic of discussion. We'll be right back after this short break. To stay with us. Welcome back. We're in conversation with Dr. Roshan Perera, former director of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, and Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar, former lecturer, or senior lecturer rather, of the Department of Sociology of the University of Jaffna. Dr. Roshan, I think we were talking about a number of things with Dr. Ahilan before we moved in for a break. The IMF. Sri Lanka went into the IMF, but was it needed or not? And then whether the reforms implemented are truly necessary for Sri Lanka, or should we look at something different? I heard you earlier when you said hard-hitting reforms are necessary. What are these? And Sri Lanka's the policy journey, you spoke about the burden on the state, whether it's expenditure in terms of salaries, or even SOE reforms. We haven't spoken about that as much as we should, given the fact that back in 2022, we spoke about SOEs, the need to reform and reutilization of SOEs in a more economically beneficial manner to the country. So are we missing something here?
Yes, but I just want to go back to sort of the economic model of Sri Lanka. What would be the kind of economic model that will take us out of this? And I think for that, we have to remember that we have a small economy with only 22 million people. So just producing for that economy is not going to work. I mean, we're not going to be able to take people out of poverty or upper growth trajectory. We have to be able to produce for the global market. And to do that, trade liberalization is the way to go. And we've seen that in many countries. We've seen it in India in 1991. They were an import substitution economy, but they liberalized, and they are now racing ahead in terms of manufacturing and IT, etc. Same with China. China was initiated these market reforms, joined the WTO, and then they just saw rapid economic growth, became the global manufacturing hub. As well as they created millions of jobs, taking millions of people out of poverty. Same with South Korea in the 20th century and late 20th century, and also Vietnam more recently. We've seen that. So we have to acknowledge that it is through trade liberalization, greater trade liberalization. And Sri Lanka was one of the first movers in terms of opening our trade barriers. In the late 1970s. But unfortunately, due to various political expediency and various other factors, we became more and more protectionist, actually. I say that we have become really protectionist. So we have put not just tariffs, but we have huge number of para-tariffs and non-tariff barriers that prevent goods from coming into the country, which would make it cheaper for the citizens, one in terms of food imports, but also in terms of intermediate goods, which are raw materials, which then you can produce and sell to the rest of the world. So we've actually become more protectionist. So I think some of the reforms that, and the budget this time has actually mentioned many, because I think, again, they have mentioned exports, and they have also mentioned several export reforms. And I just want to focus on that, because I think without exports, we are going to be out. But I kind of did an analysis of budgets over the last 10 years, and I looked at, okay, what kind of reforms did they sort of highlight, or did they emphasize in those budgets? So we had things like trade agreements or FTAs, the opening of industrial parks, the single window facility, a one-stop shop, setting up a one-stop shop, gradually reducing these para-tariffs, etc. And you'd see that out of those 10 years, more than 7 to 8 of those years, we have actually mentioned these reforms. So my point is, we keep talking about these reforms, which are the things that are necessary for us to be able to become an export destination or an export hub. But we do not do the reforms. We do not actually do those reforms. And what I would like to say is, earlier I talked about the global environment. I mean, other countries are actually trying to strategize and see how they can address the current geopolitical tensions. All these reforms that I just mentioned are within our own control. It's something that we can do. We don't even have to, we're not dependent on other countries to undertake these reforms. So we really need to step up, undertake these reforms, because otherwise we're not going to be able to face the challenges that are in the future.
So are you saying beyond the IMF program, we have to, there are reforms that Sri Lanka must urgently
Exactly, because
implement?
the IMF program is really for macroeconomic stability, and we have to remember that. Their main focus is on macroeconomic stability. And this is where I think we all lots of people get it wrong, and we say that the IMF programs didn't work, because their program is to ensure that the country attains this macroeconomic stability. But as I said, stability is necessary, but not sufficient. You have to also go on to do the reforms that are necessary for growth. And often what Sri Lanka does is, we attain this macroeconomic stability, but we don't do the next step, and we don't undertake the reforms, and the reforms that you rightly mentioned. So one is the trade reform, the SOE reform, and the labor reform. If you look at the last 20 IMF programs, they have mentioned it, but they are not necessarily within the the targets of the IMF program. But what they are saying is, if the country wants to move to the next level and achieve that growth, which will take you out of crisis, you have to undertake those reforms. And for me, I'm just going to emphasize a lot on the trade reforms, because without these trade reforms, we're not going to get anywhere. We don't have the luxury of borrowing in capital markets, because we obviously, at the moment, our premiums will be very high. We need to be able to attract foreign direct investment, that is non-debt creating inflows. And to do that, we have to have undertaken these reforms. And the thing is, we have to understand that there are countries out there. We are not operating in isolation. We are operating in a global environment where there are countries that can attract these investments very quickly. So we are competing with other countries. So unless we do these reforms, it's very unlikely that we are going to be able to attract this FDI and have the kind of export base that is necessary to really take us out of this crisis.
I'd like to turn to Dr. Ahilan. I'm sure you might have something to add, but beyond that, we're also talking about inclusive development within Sri Lanka. We talk about the north, the south, the central parts of the country, but do you think the north has been given the due recognition in terms of development priorities? Are there barriers in structures or changes that should be brought about to address the development requirements in the northern province, and from an access to finance perspective? SMEs and those who really need finance and inclusion in a finance perspective, what would you say are urgently required?
Yeah, before I come to the sort of regional concerns, of course, if we can earn more through exports, it would be welcome. If we can even get tourist incomes, given the crisis, if we can get foreign earnings through the tourism sector, that would be welcome as well. But the fundamental question is, why haven't we been able to achieve it? And particularly under the current global conditions, whether it's going to be possible. Now, think about exports. 52% of our garment exports goes to the United States. So when Trump decided to raise the tariffs, and he said it's going to be 44%, brought it down to 20%, and who knows what it's going to be next year, right? So to put all our eggs in that export basket, thinking that it is somehow going to deliver, I think would be foolhardy, right? We have to diversify our economy. And in this kind of a volatile global climate, would FDI come in? And what kind of FDI is coming into Sri Lanka? Is it really supporting production? When I did an analysis of FDI over the last decade and a half, a lot of what we call FDI is actually speculative investment in real estate. You would have seen in Colombo all these condominiums coming up. That's not part of a production economy. That is speculation in real estate. So that just adds to our debt, and when the capital flies out, we get into debt trouble. So the reason why I emphasize changing our import structure, before the crisis, if you take fisheries, we said we have to export fisheries, and we were exporting about $250 million US, 200 to 250 million US dollars worth of seafood. But during that, every year, and now it's come down because the government doesn't have the foreign currency, we were importing about 200 million US dollars worth of seafood. We are an island nation, so that's what trade liberalization did. Or if you take the dairy sector, we are only 40% self-sufficient in milk foods. The rest we are importing as milk powder. Can't we produce milk in this country? So that sort of outlook also relates to what we do with the regional economy. If you take the North and the East, and I think to give credit to this government, the president himself, when he met the World Bank chief, when he meets so many other leaders of other countries, he's asked for support for projects in the North and East, for development projects, because I think this government is committed to putting more investment into the North and East, recognizing that region has suffered from a 2.5, 3 decade long war, and that's welcome. But now the question is, how do you make that work? Because implementation has its own challenges. And I think one of the big challenges of this government, now even in the current, upcoming budget for 2026, they talk about a lot of investment for the dairy sector, right? But will they be able to implement it? For that, they need to be able to move the state machinery, right? The bureaucracy, the different institutions to be able to actually deliver on those promises. And I think that is where the challenge is going to be. It's not just the government officials, the communities, everyone has to work together. And if that happens, at least we'll solve the food crisis. My main concern is that seeing children, youth, going hungry, and our wages are so low that is the situation. So we can't be talking about labor law reforms when people are not even getting a basic wage.
Right, I'm told we just have 1 minute. So for your closing remarks, a resilient economy, not just debt sustainable, I'd like you to give your comments on what Sri Lanka would look like if we get this right.
So I think it's one, I'm going to keep harping on it. We have to undertake the reforms, the hard reforms. It's not easy, and there are going to be people who are going to suffer, and that's why I say we need to have good safety nets to protect those people who would have a greater burden of reform. But there is no room for complacency, because what will happen is if we don't undertake the reforms, what generally happens is there's policy reversals and backsliding, particularly when we come to the election cycles. There'll be declining public support, because we know when the crisis hit, people were much more supportive of reforms.
Right.
And the longer we wait, there was a decline in support. And also there'll be the investor confidence also will fail unless we undertake these reforms. So, so I think I will keep plugging that we really have no room for complacency.
Dr. Ahilan?
Yeah, absolutely. We need hard reforms, but what kind of reforms, right? During the worst crisis before this one, in the 1930s and 40s, that's what led to the free education system, to the free healthcare system, to a universal food subsidy. Those were hard reforms that sustained our country for the next many decades. So we need to strengthen those pillars of our society. I would, call for those kinds of hard reforms. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. We were in conversation with Dr. Roshan Perera, economist and former director of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka with over 20 years of policy and implementation experience in macroeconomic policy in a developing country context. Thank you very much, Dr. Roshan. We were also in conversation with Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar, senior lecturer at the Department of Sociology of the University of Jaffna, a political economist and member of Executive Committee of International Development Economics. Thank you very much for your contribution to talk about the Northern Province as well. We were talking about Sri Lanka beyond crisis and the next economic chapter and resilience going forward. We'll see you again next week with yet another discussion here at Hyde Park. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.